fallen, of fallen human beings. But there's also something in our culture that tends to foster the divided life. We talk about the difference between public and private life, between church and state, between faith and reason, between spirituality and materiality, between body and soul. We often define these things as divisions, not just distinctions, but divisions. So if we are to confront this divided life, particularly in the concreteness of our own lives, we have to ask ourselves some very big questions. And so the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what am I working for? Because you and I will work way too much in this life that we should be deprived of a good answer to that question. And that question is very much addressed in John Paul's Reform Exertions on Human Work. The Pope wrote a whole encyclical on work because he saw work as very important. And he's thought that all Catholics and all people of goodwill should take a serious look about what work is about. But here is the paradox. The paradox is that we will not simply find an adequate answer to that question only through work, which means we have to ask ourselves another question. And it's an odd question, but I think it's of crucial importance, and it is this: what am I resting in? And this is the question that's addressed in John Paul's document, Deus Domini. George Weigel once said that he felt that laborum exercens on one hand about work and Deus Domini about the question of leisure and about rest are two bookends of John Paul. And they bookends that make a lot of sense that if we can put them together. But when we put those two questions together, we come to the third question about what am I living for? Questions that we should never ask once, but on a continual basis, sometimes even on a daily basis. So, in order to get at these three questions, and particularly how John Paul understands them in those two documents, I have fallen into what they often call the occupational hazard of an academic, because it all has to fit within a matrix. Sorry, it's just one of the things that academics tend to do. If it doesn't fit within a matrix, somehow it's not, don't take it serious. Now let me be very clear. You and I are way too complex to be put in boxes. This matrix is simply a pedagogical tool that I'm going to use to get my thoughts that's in here, and my thought and the thoughts of John Paul II, and get it out in kind of a visual form, and then hopefully we can have a conversation and a Q&A, okay? So that's why I use the little matrix. It's just a pedagogical tool. Academics also want to have a thesis, right? You always have a thesis statement. And my thesis, here's the thesis. And you might want to challenge this thesis. You always want to challenge someone's thesis, right? And here's the thesis. You and I will never get work right unless we get rest right. You and I will never get work right unless we get leisure right. You and I will never get Monday right unless we get Sunday right. Okay? So that's the thesis. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start right at the bottom left-hand corner of the matrix. And I'm going to go right across, and I'm going to give you three versions about how we often look at work, leisure, and how we integrate the two of them together. And I'll be trying to do that in light of what John Paul has said about these topics from those two documents. Make sense? All right. So let's start with view number one. View number one is some people look at their work as a job. And they look at work simply in terms of its economic returns. I mentioned to you I grew up in the south side of Chicago in a blue-collar neighborhood. If my friends knew that I was here talking to you about work as a calling, a vocation, I mean, they would say, you've been in the ivory tower too long. It's about the money. And they would most likely quote a guy from Chicago, a guy named Mike Royko. He's a columnist in the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Tribune. And Royko said this, he says, listen, if work is so great, how come they have to pay us to do it, huh? Come on, let's really. You know, people, in a sense, play the lottery to get out of work, not to, in a sense, enjoy work. Work is a necessary evil. So don't try to think of work as something hoity-toity or something that you get meaning out of. There's a place in Minnesota in Minneapolis called Al's Diner. And in the kitchen, there's a sign in Al's Diner that says this: "There's no fulfillment here. This is not the place you go for fulfillment. You go somewhere else," right? So some people look at their work as a job. Now, why would somebody look at their work as a job like that? There's lots of reasons. But a lot of it has to do, it seems to me, or one issue, is it has to do with this idea that some people look at their work in terms of their leisure as amusement. Right? That is, we live in a highly entertaining culture, and we like to be entertained. In fact, some of the highest paid people in our culture are entertainers, even though we certainly do have the starving artist out there. Most of the highest paid people are entertained because we like to be entertained, and we pay them. That's the market at work. But here's the thing. The way we look at that entertainment, the way we look at that amusement, is similar. You guys still listen to Billy Joel? He has a great song called Piano Man. And he has a line in there, he says, "They know it's been me they've been coming to see, to forget about life for a while." That is, we often see our leisure, our rest, as a time to escape life, to veg out, rather than to confront it. There's a French philosopher named Jacques Rouleau, and he put it this way. He said, "Instead of being the moment when we rediscover ourselves, thinking about who we ought to be, leisure is the moment when amusements succeed to the maximum in making us forget." Etymologies are very important. And the word amusement comes from the Greek word muses, which were the Greek goddesses of the liberal arts. They were the goddesses that would refresh you, would recreate you. Now, when you put the word in front of a word, it often negates it, like theist, atheist. Muses, amuse. And if you look under the English Oxford Dictionary, one of the definitions says, it defines amusements: you stare stupidly at something. It's a great description of television watching. Right? There's a sense that our amusements are not that which we recreate us, but actually they become those things which distract us. And much of our modern advertising is based on this. I was in Chicago a couple of years ago, and there was an advertisement for a chain of hotels, and the caption of it was, "The weekend getaway. Your body checks in, and your mind checks out." And in many respects, much of our, in a sense, entertainment, our amusements are captured in this. As we all know the tagline of Las Vegas: "Whatever happens in Vegas, thank you, stays in Vegas." Now, whoever said that should have gotten sued for false advertising, because the only thing that stays in Vegas is your money. Everything else comes right with you. All those things you did, human activity doesn't leave you, it stays with you. Right? But there's something about that understanding of leisure in that way. We even find this not only for the weekend, but we also find it in terms of our own celebrations. The commercialization of Christmas, the over-sentimentality of Valentine's Day, the utter decadence of St. Patrick's Day and Mardi Gras, the ghoulishness of Halloween. These days which were meant to, in a sense, refresh us, which were meant to, in a sense, help us have the meaning of what time is about, the meaning of what life is about, has just become one more exercise of consumption. So what does this tell us? If I see my work as a job, simply money, and if I see my leisure in terms of amusements, I tend to describe my life in terms of gratifications. One series of gratifications after another. And John Paul has a term that he uses, and he calls it consumerism, where we're more concerned about what we have and less concerned about what we are becoming. He is also very concerned that this actually has a way of denigrating one's work. And he talks about it in terms of economism. And he says, work as a means to consumption when one considers human labor solely, only according to its economic purpose. There is a sense that we have viewed this life in this way. And so our first view is where the focus is on the question of amusements. Now it's interesting, by the way, if you look at that view, the one problem with this view is that it has a certain kind of dirty trick to it. And here's the trick. When you focus your life on amusements, that becomes a very costly form of amusement, a costly form of leisure, which then causes you to work more, which then causes you to have less time to enjoy your amusements. And it's interesting, there's a woman named Juliet Shaw who wrote a book called The Overworked American, and she pointed out since 1948, Americans have worked far more, have been on an increasing incline of working. In the year 2000, we surpassed the Japanese. So we work harder than anybody else in terms of the Western Hemisphere, and we have less time to enjoy ourselves in our so-called leisure. So that's view number one. View number two, some people view the work as a career. And they often see the work in terms of career, in terms of the psychological rewards they get from the work. I hope many of you will have this experience of a great degree of self-esteem, of autonomy, of self-satisfaction about the work that you do. There's a guy who wrote a book called Flow, and the idea that often that my talents can match the task that I have at hand. And when there is that flow between the talents that I have and the task that's out there, and if there's a flow going on between them and the two are connected, people have a great deal of satisfaction with the work that they have. But it's interesting, by the way, about how they look at that work, that word career. The very word career comes from a French word called carrier, which is where we get the word car. It's very interesting. The automobile, the self-driven vehicle that allows me to get from here to there. See, the careerist is not money mad. The careerist is highly goal conscious. The very goal, they want to achieve things. But the way that they achieve things is usually only on their own terms. It's only in their own interest. As all your economics textbooks will tell you, you are utility maximizers seeking your own self-interest. Right? And so often people's view of work doesn't get beyond their own self-vision of it. Now, why do people look at their work this way? They often look at their work this way, or one reason is in terms of their leisure, not as amusement, but as a function, as a utility. Right? That is, we live in a culture that often sees everything in life in terms of work, even leisure. We were talking about this at dinner today. Let me give you two examples of this. I'm sure this doesn't happen here at Benedictine College, but it does happen at St. Thomas. Often education is justified in terms of its instrumental value of career. And you will hear a student say, well, why do I got to take philosophy, theology, art, music, and literature? What is it going to do for my career? Right? Now, when people talk that way, and there's good reason why, because sometimes the philosophy and theology courses are not taught very well, and so there might be a good reason why they might say that. But there's a sense that often education has been reduced to the idea of its instrumental value. Now that's unfortunate, particularly from a Catholic and from a Western perspective, because the very word for leisure in Greek and Latin comes from a word called schola, which is where we get the word school. School is leisure. I don't think you've ever thought that, have you? But why would the Catholic tradition and why would the Western tradition see school as leisure? Because leisure is understood not as an escape or not as a function, but as a way to confront reality, engage reality, receive reality. So you take philosophy and theology and art and music and the sciences so as to see the fullness of reality and not just simply its parts. But this is not only for school, we even see our own rest in terms of this. Rest in order to sharpen the saw, in order to be more productive. There's a very wonderful book by Stephen Covey called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this is one of his habits. I think he got this one wrong, because he described this habit as to sharpen the saw in order to be more productive. And the reason why I think he got this wrong is because I think he got the reason wrong. Let me give you an example. There's a psychologist, Hungarian psychologist, Sándor Ferenczi, and he coined a very interesting term called the Sunday neurotic. And the reason why he coined this term is because he had patients who would often find themselves somewhat depressed, somewhat anxious-filled, somewhat filled of angst, of meaninglessness, often on Sunday afternoons and Sunday evenings. You should do a little audit sometime in your life. When do you find most uneasy, most unsettled, most somewhat depressed? And he was finding people doing that on Sunday afternoons. Now, the question is why? Why Sunday afternoons and Sunday evenings? Well, the obvious answer is, you have to go back to work on Monday, right? But he said, actually, that's not the reason. The reason why he said that is the case is because people who try to rest and they don't know how to rest will find themselves in knots. The reason why we find Sunday afternoons and Sunday evenings so difficult is that we try to rest and we don't know how to do it. And that causes us difficulty. Right? It's an interesting thought, and an interesting thing to think about in one's own life. So what does that tell us? It tells us often that if I see my work in terms of a career and my leisure in terms of a function, that which serves my work, I define my life in terms of a series of achievements. And again, John Paul uses this term called careerism, where I'm more concerned about what I do and less concerned about what I become in the doing. Let me give you 2 examples of this. You may not remember this name, although I'm sure anybody over 30 would. A guy named Lee Iacocca, who was the former CEO of the chairman of the Chrysler Corporation. In the early 1980s, it was similar to the 2007 and 8. We were in a recession, and Chrysler, like it is now, was in very difficult shape. And Lee Iacocca turned Chrysler around and made it a very successful company, at least for a period of time. And when he retired from the Chrysler Corporation in the 90s, he was on 2 years after his retirement, he was on the front cover of the Fortune magazine with this caption, "How I Flunked Retirement." A man who knew exactly who he was as the CEO of the Chrysler Corporation found himself lost outside of that role. An economic giant on one hand, and yet, if one could say, a spiritual dwarf on another. One can only admire him that he had the guts to, in a sense, put this out on the front cover of the Fortune magazine. But it shows that sometimes people can, in a sense, achieve a lot in life and still fail to understand who they are. Or you probably remember this man, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. When Johnson retired from the presidency, a woman named Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote his biography. She went down to his ranch to do this, to interview him. And a couple of years ago, I saw an article in the New York Times about which she wrote. And here's what she said about LBJ. She said this: "And yet the man I saw in his retirement had spent so many years in pursuit of power, work, power, and individual success, that he had absolutely no psychic or emotional resources left to commit himself to anything once the presidency was taken from him. Years of concentration solely on work meant that in his retirement he could find no solace in recreation, sports, or hobbies, or his family, or a faith life, or a community. That is, his work spent him." And here we come to, I think, one of the most important insights of John Paul's encyclical on human work. And it's a term that he uses that he calls the subjective dimension of work. And here's what it is in a nutshell. When you and I work, we have to change things. And if we don't change things well, we should get fired. Because work is about changing things. But as those changes occur, we simultaneously change things in here. And that we often don't get evaluated for. That we often don't have insight for. And that we sometimes become clueless to what the changes are occurring within us. And John Paul points out that that is sometimes the modern problem. We can define through formulas, through techniques, through all sorts of things about what changes have occurred out there. But we have not had great insight sometimes about how work has changed us in here. And there's a man named AlMukhtar who wrote, one of the most influential philosophers of our time. And he wrote this about the so-called subjective dimension of work. And he says, the aim internal to work, such as farming, fishing, agriculture, construction, business, nursing, doctoring, plumbing, whatever, when they are in good order, is never only to catch fish or to produce beef or milk or to build houses. It is to do so in a manner consonant with the excellences of the craft, so that not only is there a good product, but the craftsperson is perfected through and in his her activity. That is, the dignity of work comes not from what you produced. The dignity of work comes from what you become. And there's a philosopher named John Ruskin who put it this way: the highest reward or punishment for one's work is not what he gets from it, but what he becomes by it. The insight of the subjective dimension of work is that our actions carry us to places. Your actions are the prime indicator of your destiny. You are not remaining static, you are becoming something. You are going somewhere. That's why your activities are of such grave importance. That's why you should pray about them. That's why you should have people who can, in a sense, counsel you. Okay. They're very, very important. So what does that tell us? Our second view of work, or really, in a sense, both views of work, tell us that we have a problem. We have a moral and spiritual problem in this country. That often the way that we understand our work and that we understand our leisure has some, in a sense, a ways to go. We have to find a more robust understanding of what we mean by these terms. And this, where it seems to me, is John Paul's great contribution. Because he's written two major documents that addresses these two concerns. So let me try to explain what he means by this. John Paul would describe our work as a vocation. It's interesting that the word vocation, the word vocare, comes from the word to call. And what I'd like to focus on is this idea of the call to give. In the Catholic tradition, it seems to me, when we say the word vocation, we use it for lots of ways. But I think there are three major ways we should think about it. The first is that you and I, our first vocation is to be human. It's not to be a professor. It's not to be an entrepreneur. It's not to be a nurse. It's to be a human being. Because all of us are created to give of our lives. There's a great line. Again, this line was quoted so many times by John Paul II from Gaudium Spes. And it goes like this: a person cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. I am at my best not when I'm calculating, not when I'm acquiring, not when I'm trying to take things. I am always at my best when I am giving of myself to something. Although key to it will be, what is the something? Our second vocation is often to a state of life. And particularly in the Catholic tradition, we speak about the three states of life in terms of religious, priestly, and the lay state. In the lay state, it's either married or single. And I suspect most of you will be in the lay state. And it's a very important vocation, which is in a sense, many respects, under attack, and in a sense, has in a sense, endured great damage. But I have a colleague of mine, Bob Kennedy. Bob has 12 children. And he one time said to me something that was very profound. He said, you know, my kids only have one dad, and my wife only has one husband. My students have a lot of faculty members. But there's something about the primacy of the vocation of the family that can never be sacrificed to the work, to the vocation of work. But with that said, nonetheless, we are called to work. And John Paul describes it this way. He says, work constitutes one of the fundamental dimensions of our earthly existence and of our vocation, precisely because our work allows us to exercise our gifts to serve others. This idea is of crucial importance, that work is about giving. It is in its very nature. Let me go at it two ways. One is, let me look at another culture, the Native American culture. It's a culture that has its own particular problems, like all cultures do, but it has its wonderful, great insights. You remember the story of the so-called Indians and Puritans? When they first met each other, they exchanged gifts. And when they went away from each other and they came back and saw each other, the Indians noticed that the white guy still had the gift. And so they asked for it back, which is where we get the term Indian givers. We don't say that anymore, and that's good, but it was something that we said. Now, the white guy didn't quite get it. We see it as a derogatory term, but what the white guy didn't get understood is that in the Native American culture, there is something deeply understood that when a gift was given to somebody, it had to be used for others in order for the gift to develop the person. That is, if I use my gifts only for myself, my gifts corrupt me. It is the law of the gift. It is the way that we are made. It is the way that we're structured. If I use my gifts only for myself, it destroys me. It doesn't develop me. I only develop in terms of my gifts to be used for others. In the Catholic tradition, John Paul talks about it in terms of the gospel of work. That is, there is within Revelation, within the gospel, a way that helps us understand it. And it is this way. That is, that our work continues creation. That we are collaborators of God, not merely individual utility maximizers. We are stewards of creation, not the owners of it. We are participants in this creation. It is the way that we should look at our work. It is revealed in the Holy Book that we are participants in God's creation, and we, in a sense, we will either cooperate with it to move it forward, or we will frustrate it and move it backward. The second point is that our work is fallen. That is, it is not just markets, and it's not just formulas or techniques out there. There is sin and vice out there. The financial crisis that we have just gone through and still continues to go through is not merely a matter of bad incentives or bad laws. It's also about vice and sin. We have learned quite clearly that we cannot discount virtue in our market economy, because formulas and markets will not satisfy the economic order. But it also points out that our work is redeemable. That is, the suffering that we experience should never lead to simply despair, and that our fundamental role in this world is to alleviate the sufferings of others and not cause that suffering. Because the one thing we will experience in the work that we have is suffering. And it will either make us bitter, or it can make us better. But it will only make us better when it is redeemed by the cross as we move forward on it. We could talk a lot more about the nature of work, but it does present us with a problem, or at least it presents me with a problem. I am all for the idea of continuing God's creation. I'm all for of giving work to others, to serve others. But I find out that I often fall into a particular trap. And the trap goes like this. I give of myself, and all of a sudden something in my mind starts saying, why am I giving 70% and only giving 30%? Why am I working harder than my wife? By the way, I never say that to my wife, I just think it. Just so you know. I've learned the hard way on that one. Right? And I find, why do my colleagues not, in a sense, appreciate the work they do? Or why can't they do it? And what happens is I start to feel like a victim. And then that victimization tends to turn into a certain kind of resentment. And then the resentment tends to turn into a cynicism. And this idea of giving of myself, which is supposed to be a good thing, is now turned into something that is actually turning on myself. And it brings us to the issue about why leisure is so important. There's a Latin aphorism that goes like this: Nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot give only. You cannot work only. You need to rest. And the rest in here is not an achievement, but it's fundamentally, it's a form of contemplation. It is what we call a receivement. It is a contemplative outlook to receive the world, not to act upon it. Benedict XVI has a great line in one of his books when he wrote his Cardinal Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianity. And it goes like this. He says, the person comes to the profoundest sense of himself, not through what he does, but through what he accepts. Not through what he achieves, but through what he receives. And this, by the way, is one of the hardest things for Americans to get. Because we always think we have to achieve it. And we have a hard time sometimes receiving it. Let me give you 3 habits of this idea of receptivity. And when I say receptivity, it's precisely what I mean by leisure. Because leisure at its heart as an act of contemplation is an act of receptivity. The first habit is the habit of solitude and of daily silence. Not just the external silence out there, but even more difficult, the internal silence. Because you and I have tapes going on all day long. Sometimes those tapes are about the grandeur of our own illusions. You know, the idea that I'm the unappreciated genius. If they would just understand what I have to give, I would become president. You know? The debate scenarios that I have with my colleagues about why they're so wrong or why I'm so right. Right? The anger that sometimes can occur with it. The heroic speeches or the heroic acts that I would do if I had the opportunity. That is, we got tapes going on that's been going on for years. And sometimes we don't even know they're going on. And we have to stop them. And in the Benedictine tradition, this is a very important part of what prayer is. Stop the tapes. This is why the Jesus prayer is such an important part of the tradition. Just say Jesus and shut up. Just shut up. And let God speak to you. Because if I got the tapes going on, I can't let anything come in. Because the tapes have filled up the mind. So, daily silence. The second one is a habit of celebration, of weekly Sabbaths. And this is why John Paul's document, Deus Domini, is so important. And it also, quite frankly, is where we have to always be mindful of our Jewish brother and sister. They have taken the Sabbath usually far more seriously than we have. And there are actually many traditions or communities in the Catholic tradition that are now taking it right now. Christ Redeemer and some others who have reclaimed the Sabbath. Because if we don't, this is what John Paul said. When Sunday loses its fundamental meaning and becomes merely part of a weekend, it can happen that people stay locked in within a horizon so limited that they can no longer see the heavens. Hence, though they are ready to celebrate, they are incapable of doing so. The Sabbath is crucial to our own understanding of celebrations. If we do not reclaim Sunday, we cannot reclaim Christmas and Easter and St. Patrick's Day. By the way, do you know, both my parents are from Ireland. St. Patrick's Day, there were 2 days when the pubs were closed in Ireland. One was Good Friday and the other was St. Patrick's Day. Until they got TV and they saw all the parades going on in New York and they said, gosh, if they're having a party, why don't we? So they opened up the pubs at St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. So, habit of celebration. The habit of service, of going to the margins. It's very interesting. In Days Domini, John Paul talks about this idea that Sunday, while it is a day of rest, should also be a day of giving ourselves to those who, in a sense, are shut in, those who are poor, those who are elderly, those who are lonely. That it should animate in that. There's a man named Jean Vanier who founded a thing called the L'Arche movement for mentally challenged folks. And he points out the importance that we ought not to simply do things for people. We ought not to simply do things for the poor, but we are to be with the poor. And if we are with the poor, they will give us things that no one else can give us. So, what does this tell us? Let me tell you a story that may connect these 3 habits of silence, celebration, and service. I met Mother Teresa twice in my life. Once was in Calcutta and the other was in Chicago. And when I was in Calcutta, I was giving a talk at the Indian Institute of Management. And my host was Hindu, and he knew I was Catholic. And he says, would you like to go meet Mother Teresa? And I said, sure. So we hopped in a cab, we went down to the mother house, and we walked in, and there she was. And my Hindu friend drops to his knees, and he's trying to kiss her feet. And Mother Teresa's trying to pick him up, and he's trying to kiss the feet. And there's this wrestling match going on. And the only thought I had in my mind was, man, she has big feet. God, is she short. And boy, is she old. And aren't you an idiot that you can't think of something more profound than her physical appearances? You have the icon of holiness, and all I could think about was her physical appearances. Well, we had a delightful 20-minute conversation. She asked us questions, we asked her questions, we went back and forth a little bit. And as we were leaving, she says, I want to give you my business card. All right. And this is what was on her business card. The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace. Mother Teresa had a wonderful capacity to make very wonderful, profound things, very simple, but not simplistic. And she started her day in silence. She didn't start her day in an agenda. She didn't start her day in what she wanted to do. She started her day in receptivity. And in that receptivity came prayer. And in that prayer blossomed faith. And in that faith came this ability to love, to serve, and to be at peace to the work that she was doing. So, what does it tell us? John Paul is telling us that if we look at our work as a vocation, and if we look at our leisure as contemplation, at its heart as receptivity, there we have the ingredients, the capacity for integration, for real integrity. Now that word is bandied around quite a bit, particularly in business circles. But the word itself comes from integritas. It's where we get the word integer, a whole number. To be whole. We were talking about this at dinner today. Not simply to be balanced, but to be centered. Right? Because what did I say at the beginning of this talk? What I said at the beginning of this talk is that you and I are divided. John Paul was very cognizant of that phenomenon. It is right within the documents of Vatican II. And one of the things that we have to be mindful of our own spiritual life is how do we become whole? And it is not something that you get, but rather you hope that you can participate in deeper and deeper and deeper levels of it. It is a lifelong project. It is not something you accomplish in a day. Which gets at this idea about putting these two ideas together. That you and I are called to be contemplative practitioners. We are called to be doers. You are going to your Benedictine college to get a career, to get a vocation, to get work, as you should. But you are also being educated in the liberal arts, particularly within the Catholic tradition, which is an attempting to think in first principles, think reflectively, think contemplatively. And I would say that contemplative practitioner is at best captured in a phrase that David Schindler, a theologian out east, and he put it this way: when we first experience our being as created, as being gifted life, this receiving enables us to see our doing and having as ways of giving, which they are meant to be. That is this: you and I must understand that we have received great gifts, and be cognizant of where that gift giving is given. And in cognizant of that, it will help us to understand about what we are to do with those gifts. So, a full matrix. Let me say a few things about this, and then I'll wrap it up. Point number one, it's a pedagogical tool. Right? We're more complex than these boxes. And the fact is we're all over the place, right? Some of us may look at our work as a job, and yet we see our leisure in terms of contemplation. Some might see our work as in terms of vocation and spend most of our time in amusement. It's not linear. We're all over the place. Sometimes it depends on the day. The second point I want to make very clear is that there is nothing wrong with work as a job. I work for money. I've gone into my academic vice president and said, you know what, you don't pay me enough, I want more money. There's nothing wrong with wanting to live better. There's also nothing wrong with work as a career. There's nothing wrong with being rewarded for the achievements and enjoying those achievements and climbing the corporate ladder. The problem is that those visions of work are way too small for the human spirit. St. Augustine, which Benedict has been quite influenced by, said this in the Confessions. He says, "The house of my soul is too small for you to come to it. May it be enlarged by you." We walk around with small visions of work. God wants to enlarge our vision of work. John Paul has written an encyclical that enlarges our understanding of work, that goes beyond often the economic models, the financial models, and whatever model that we might have. The same thing with leisure. There is nothing wrong with leisure as a music or as a function, but it is too small for the human spirit. And lastly, the last point is the question of integrity. The most recent social encyclical that's been written in the church has been written by Benedict XVI called Caritas in Veritate. And he defines charity this way. He says, charity is love received and given. It's an interesting description. And he's right within the tradition. That love is first received. That we need to receive God's love. To receive the creation. Receive the gifts that he's given us. And once we recognize that receptivity and participate in that receptivity, then we have the capacity to give of our lives in ways that, in a sense, can be done in only the way that God wants us to have it done. So, thank you very much.